Hello everybody, today we are going to be looking at all 32 head coaches in the NFL, ranking how they line up, how they stack up against each other. Let's dive right into it here. We are going to start with Jonathan Gannon for the Arizona Cardinals. I think for Gannon, he's very unproven. I will say that I do think that he was potentially a little bit overhyped last year because I did think that he had a lot of talent on that Philadelphia defense. I did think there were times where he was a little over-aggressive. I thought there were other times where he just sat back too much. I thought he was a decent hire, but I will say he was potentially my least favorite new head coach that was hired this offseason. I don't think that his resume doesn't deserve to be hired as a head coach, but I do think that he was potentially helped out by a lot of talent on that defense. I think he's going to be in for a rough year with Kyler Murray likely missing a decent chunk of the season. I do think he is obviously unproven. You can't say he's too high or too low. Next, you have Arthur Smith for the Atlanta Falcons. I do think he was a fantastic offensive coordinator for the Titans back when he was really getting the most out of Derrick Henry. I think in a very run-heavy offense this year with Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, and a lot of talented players on that offensive line as well. I think they could have a much better offense. I do think he is one of the better run game coordinators in the NFL. There is still a bit to be desired when it comes to the passing game and perhaps the CEO type being able to know how to motivate players, how to get the most out of players. But I do think he is a solid coach, and I do think there's a decent chance that he can lead the Falcons to an NFC South divisional title this year in a very weak division. Next up, we have John Harbaugh. I think he is in the great tier. He hasn't won a lot in the playoffs in recent years. Obviously, he did get the Super Bowl. I do think that he has stuck to some pretty bad offensive coordinators. Greg Roman obviously comes to mind there. They finally do make the change, and I think bringing in Todd Monken was a big get for this Ravens team. I do think that he is a very good CEO type of coach. He is somebody that a lot of the players really buy into, and I think is a really, really good coach. But he does really kind of need to get back over that hump in the playoffs, really continue to really prove that the Ravens are a winning organization that can make it to the Super Bowl when they have an MVP caliber quarterback. Next, we have Zach Taylor. I think Taylor has really gained a lot of respect over the past few years. A lot of it is the talent on this Bengals roster. Obviously, you have Joe Burrow and some fantastic weapons, and that makes the job of the head coach a lot easier. But I think Taylor has done a much better job in recent years of knowing what levers to pull at what times, being able to mix up the offense and be able to really play to his players' strengths. He's incredibly flexible when it comes to his coaching style. He came in originally, ran a lot of outside zone and Sean McVay, type of plays. But now that he had Joe Burrow, he's completely changed his offense. It's more of a spread offense. There's a lot more power run game rather than the outside zone that is so popular in LA with the Rams and San Francisco with Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers. I think he's done a really good job adapting to his players' strengths and really getting the most out of them. Been to 2 straight AFC Championship games, so I certainly think he deserves a lot of respect. Harbaugh has done it a bit more consistently for a longer time, but I think there's totally an argument you can make that Zach Taylor could be above him here. Next, we have Sean McDermott. I think McDermott is a great coach, but I will say he is continuing to disappoint in the playoffs, and that does need to change. Obviously, with the Chiefs 2 years ago, they came back from a ridiculous deficit. He had a rough season at times last year. They kind of got beat down by the Bengals in the playoffs. I do think that he is a good coach, but I will say he does really kind of need to start getting a little bit further in the playoffs. They need to make a Super Bowl. They need to win a Super Bowl. They were pretty much the heavy favorites pretty much the entire year last year and just couldn't get it done when it mattered. There's too much talent on this roster to not be making AFC Championship games and Super Bowls. And, obviously the AFC is really tough, but they definitely need to be a bit more consistent in the playoffs. Otherwise, McDermott, I do think there is a chance, could be on the hot seat in a year or two. Next, we have Frank Reich. I think Reich is a very solid coach. I think the Indianapolis situation was a complete disaster last year, and he really hasn't had much good quarterback play at all throughout his tenure as the Colts coach. And, you had Andrew Luck for a time being there, but since then, it's been Phillip Rivers, it's been Matt Ryan, it's been Carson Wentz. They've had a lot of struggles at quarterback, and I really think that's where Reich thrives. I think he's going to get the most out of Bryce Young. He's brought in a great staff that I really think can get the most out of this Panthers team. Much like I said with Arthur Smith, I do think that there's a lot of opportunities for him to win this division with a talented young roster. I actually do think that Reich has proven a little bit more than Arthur Smith. In his time in Indianapolis, Reich was a really good offensive mind and a really good coach, and somebody that, I really, really like that signing for the Panthers. I think he could certainly turn this organization around. Next, we have Matt Eberflus. I'm going to put him in the unproven but exciting tier. I think that with Eberflus, he really didn't have much of a chance last year. The Bears completely gutted their roster. They traded away pretty much everybody of relevance, got rid of Allen Robinson, Roquan Smith, Robert Quinn. This team was very bare bones. I thought, they finished as the worst team in the league. He was a first-year head coach. It's tough to really give him too much grief for finishing the worst in the league with that roster, but he does need to really kind of take a step this year. There's big expectations for Justin Fields to take a big step in year 3, and I do think that there is a lot of pressure on Eberflus to really kind of get the most out of these players. The front 7 on the defense is still pretty rough, but I do think that there is opportunities for Eberflus to kind of show his defensive prowess and be a much better head coach than he showed last year. Next, we have Kevin Stefanski. I think Stefanski is just solid. He did a good job last year getting the most out of Jacoby Brissett. Once Watson came back, Watson looked kind of rough, but I do think Stefanski got a playoff win in Cleveland with Baker Mayfield. That has to count for something. I don't think he is a bad coach by any means. I kind of like the way he operates his business, but this Browns team is too talented to be consistently missing the playoffs, to not be competing for the AFC North crown. They need to be a team that is truly competitive. I do think he could swing up to great if he really has a big season this year, or he could be potentially on the hot seat if things do go south. I think he's a solid coach. I do think that this Browns roster is very talented, though, and he's going to have to show that he can get some wins, because ultimately that's what translates as a head coach. You got to get wins. You got to make the playoffs and make a run and maybe compete for a Super Bowl. The Browns haven't been able to do that. I think Stefanski is the best coach they've had in a long time, but he really kind of needs to take that step this year. Next, we have McCarthy, and I have just found McCarthy to be one of the least inspiring coaches in a long time. I just don't think that he's very great at what he does. He's consistently been surrounded by fantastic quarterback play. He had Aaron Rodgers for years back when he won a Super Bowl in Green Bay. Dak Prescott's been pretty good for him as well. There's just always been a really good roster with McCarthy, and I just don't think that he is that special of a coach. I just don't think McCarthy is a great CEO coach. I don't find him to be incredibly relatable. He's just not somebody I would be excited about having as my head coach in the NFL. I don't think he's a terrible coach by any means, but I just don't find him to be inspiring. He can put a decent staff around him. Dan Quinn's a great defensive coordinator. Moore was a really good offensive coordinator for a time as well. I do think that McCarthy can build a staff, but I just don't know that he is the best. Even though he does get some decent results in the regular season, he just needs to be much, much better in the playoffs. The Cowboys team in a weak NFC needs to be much more competitive and really competing for that NFC Championship crown. Next, we have Sean Payton. I am going to put Payton in the great tier. I think Payton has really kind of shown in New Orleans to be, he was a top 3 head coach in the league probably back when he was in New Orleans. He retired for a year. Was in the booth. I do think that, his comments about Nathaniel Hackett were completely unnecessary, but he's still a very good coach. Somebody that kind of runs more of that pro-style offense. He was considered very innovative for a time, and now he's kind of reverted more to being that traditional pro-style offense just because the times have changed. He's not really running a ton of that outside zone stuff. He's not running a lot of the, crazy short game RPO action. I just think that he's a really good offensive mind, knows when to pull what levers at what time, and I do think he's a good CEO coach as well. He consistently got just great play out of that Saints team that he was the coach of for a very long time. I just think he's one of the better CEO coaches in the league and definitely has some real good offensive prowess as well. Next, we have Dan Campbell. I think Dan Campbell's a really fun coach. I'm going to put him in the solids here. He brings so much energy, so much excitement to this team. He's a great culture fit in Detroit. Players just want to play for him. They want to fight for him, and he's so much fun to watch. He needs to get some of those team results. The Lions haven't made the playoffs under him. I think he has done a great job building a staff. Ben Johnson is one of the best offensive coordinators in the league, and a great job by Campbell to keep him around for another season. Once we get the team results, I definitely think he will bump up into that great tier. I love what Dan Campbell does, but you just can't put him too high until he really shows that this team can be a true force in the NFC. Up next, Matt LaFleur. I think Matt LaFleur is a solid coach. I do think he has benefited with being with Aaron Rodgers for a long time. I also don't love his unwavering support for Joe Barry, who just can't seem to get fired. Even though he's the worst defensive coordinator in the league, I just can't get behind that decision. And I do think there's been some questionable personnel decisions, and I do think that LaFleur is a good coach, but I do think that for a long time he's just been very successful because he's had great players on his team, and I do think that he's not always getting the most out of those players, and he's not always sticking with the correct coaches when he should. So I do think that he's a good coach. He's a solid coach, but I do think there is a little bit of maybe he's not a great coach like we once thought. Next, we have Doug Peterson. I do think Peterson is a great coach. He really showed that last year when he just really took over this Jaguars team and made them competitive after they were a complete dumpster fire under Urban Meyer the year before. He got the most out of Trevor Lawrence, really kind of kickstarted his development. I think with Calvin Ridley coming into the fold this year and some other exciting players, I do think that Doug Peterson is going to do a really good job with this offense in particular. I think this is a very fun team to watch. He's already got a Super Bowl ring with the Eagles. I think they were very competitive last year, and they're a lot of fun to watch. Andy Reid is obviously the best of the best at this point. He's done it consistently for a long time. He's won multiple Super Bowls with the Chiefs. Obviously, had a lot of success with the Eagles as well. Consistently gotten the most out of rosters. It certainly helps as the best quarterback and the best player in the league in Patrick Mahomes, but absolutely Andy Reid deserves that number one spot. It's pretty much unquestioned at this point in my mind. I think he is the best head coach in the league. Next, we have Brandon Staley. He's less inspiring to me. He's somebody that I thought should have been fired a long time ago. I think he consistently underperforms the talent on the roster. I know they've dealt with injuries. I know that the Chargers have dealt with some bad luck over the years as well, but he cannot be consistently underperforming or missing the playoffs on a consistent basis, and that's what he's done in LA. He just has not done a good job getting the most out of a truly elite franchise quarterback in Justin Herbert. This offense has just not been consistently good. It's been horribly called, and he's stuck by Lombardi for a long time. They finally move on from him, but I truly think that it was either move on from Lombardi or get fired, and he finally budged, but he just has shown a willingness to stick with incompetent, bad coordinators. He's not gotten the most out of his players, and I really think that if this Chargers team struggles or, they're maybe not hitting their stride when they should midseason, there's a decent chance that Staley gets fired, and I think that is truly something that should happen. I thought it should have happened after this past year, after they choked away to the Jaguars a huge lead in the playoffs. He's just not a good coach, in my opinion, and somebody that I definitely would put in that less inspiring tier. Next, we have Sean McVay. McVay is one of the best of the best. His roster is gutted at this point. He does not have the players to be a consistently successful head coach with that level of talent on the team. It's an incredibly young roster, but I think he is a truly inspiring head coach. He's an offensive genius. I think he's truly built an amazing culture in LA when it comes to building a great coaching staff, getting players to buy into a system. He's definitely one of the best head coaches in the league. Even if his roster is not going to be good enough to really kind of support him being a top 3 team in the league, I definitely think he is a top 3 coach in the league. He is definitely somebody that I think is one of the best, consistently just gets the most out of his players because his system is so good, and definitely very relatable as well. Definitely one of the best head coaches in the league. Next, we have Josh McDaniels. I think he is less inspiring for sure. I will say that I do think McDaniels has been dealt a tough hand. I think Derek Carr was a lot worse than people realized last year. He didn't really have a great roster to work with. That defense has been abysmal for years, and now it's really, really bad with pretty much nobody besides Max Crosby and maybe Hobbs. And so this has been a rough roster to kind of deal with, and I do think that last year a lot of things kind of went wrong that weren't all on Josh McDaniels. I don't think he's an amazing head coach. I do think he's one of the less inspiring options in the NFL, but I will say the roster certainly doesn't help. I do think that he has a lot of room to improve. He hasn't necessarily had the most successful head coaching career even before this, but I do think that there is some talent, and he is a good offensive mind. Next, we have Mike McDaniel. I think McDaniel is a very solid coach. He's somebody that runs a really good system. He knows what players fit his system. He wants speed, he wants athleticism, and he wants to really kind of let Tua just play in space, let these guys get the balls in their hands and run. And he does that very well. I don't think he's necessarily shown to be a great head coach at this point, but he's definitely somebody that runs a really good system, knows how to get the most out of his players, and I do think he is a really funny dude as well. Next, we have Bill Belichick. Maybe he hasn't been the best head coach in the league like he was once he had Tom Brady, but really still has shown to be one of the best, getting the most out of that defense in particular. I still think he's the best defensive coach in the entire NFL, just consistently running crazy stuff. It's just, he's so difficult to scheme against offensively. I still think Bill Belichick deserves to be in the elite tier. He's still one of the best coaches in the league and still the best defensive mind in football, so that's going to put him in that top tier. Next, we have Dennis Allen. I think he's one of the least inspiring head coaches in the league. Just not somebody that I think brings a ton of energy. He's not somebody that think really has a huge control of the locker room as well. He's just, I don't think, one of the better head coaches in the league. I thought it'd be a little bit more of a seamless transition between Sean Payton and Dennis Allen because Allen's been there for so long, but he really just didn't seem to have a great grasp of what it takes to be a successful NFL head coach. I do think that if the Saints do poorly, he could certainly be fired, and not somebody that I really find super inspiring this year. So he's going to go in that tier there. Brian Daboll, I think, absolutely already deserves to be in the great tier. He got so much out of a Giants roster that, to be honest, was decent but not amazing. He really put Daniel Jones in the best possible position to succeed. He got the most out of Saquon Barkley, got the most out of players like Dexter Lawrence and some of the players on their back end of the defense as well. I just think that he's brought in a great staff. He's surrounded himself with players that know how to play. He was the most qualified head coaching hire of last year's cycle, and I definitely think that based on what he showed last year, outperforming expectations like crazy and winning a playoff game, he already deserves to be in that great head coaching tier, somebody I love as the Giants head coach moving forward. Next, we have Robert Saleh. I think Saleh is still a solid coach, but he is a bit unproven. This Jets team has had Zach Wilson for the past few years. They've kind of been crippled by bad quarterback play. I think Saleh did a really good job getting a lot out of great defensive players. Sauce Gardner obviously comes to mind, but also Quinnen Williams in that front seven. He's really good as a defensive coach. Obviously the 49ers defensive coordinator before coming over, and he was fantastic in that role. The Jets defense was great last year, but the offense still has left a lot to be desired. The team success hasn't been there for Saleh, so I do think that he's got to prove a little bit more team success, a little bit better. Now he has the chance to do so with Aaron Rodgers at the helm. I do think that he could move up into that great tier, but I also think that means there's extra expectations this year if they really aren't able to compete for the playoffs and be at least a force in the AFC East, which is a really good division. I do think that he could be out the door if this season kind of falls apart and the Jets disappoint. Next, we have Nick Sirianni. I think he is a great coach and somebody that deserves to be towards the top of this great tier as well. He's somebody that really got a lot out of some really good players last year, but this Eagles offense was so well coached. Obviously, Shane Steichen has a big part to do with that as well. We'll get to him later, but he just surrounded himself with great coordinators. Both got poached away to be head coaches. There was a lot of talent on this roster, but he really adapted the run game especially really well to the strengths of this team. He showed that he's willing to adapt, that he's willing to change to play for the strengths of his players. I think that's one of the most underrated coaching traits in the entire league. I think he's got a good scheme and definitely a solid CEO type as well. So I think Sirianni does deserve to be in that tier with the team success already that they have had. Making the Super Bowl, they were real close to winning it. I definitely think he deserves to be in that great tier. Next, we have Mike Tomlin. Tomlin is in the elite tier. Just the insane, sustained success that he's had for so long puts him in that tier. I do think it is truly impressive that he's not had a losing season in his career. He has inherited a really good roster back when he took over for the Steelers, and after obviously winning the Super Bowl back in 2011, they really haven't been able to be super successful since then. In the playoffs with some of the best rosters in the AFC, I do think there's an argument that he hasn't necessarily performed as well as he should have in the playoffs, but on a consistent basis, being a great CEO type coach, putting out really good defenses, he's absolutely one of the best in the league and deserves to be in that top tier. Next, we have Pete Carroll. My respect for Pete Carroll has grown immensely. I think he's in this great tier as one of the top guys. I think for a long time, a lot of people thought that Pete Carroll was kind of carried by that amazing Legion of Boom defense, Russell Wilson. Well, last year, the defense really wasn't supposed to be very good. He had Geno Smith at quarterback. A lot of people, including myself, thought they'd be one of the worst teams in the league. And he so outperformed that expectation. He just consistently continues to get great production out of players that really shouldn't necessarily be giving you that amazing production. I just think that he deserves a lot of credit for the kind of consistency and really sustained success that he's had over the years. Depending on whatever the factors are around him, he's done a really good job, and I do think that he deserves to be in that great head coaching conversation and one of the better ones in the league. Next, Todd Bowles. I think he's on the hot seat. I think he just didn't look like he had control of his roster last year. Obviously, Tom Brady gone now. I definitely think that's going to hurt things even more. Baker Mayfield or Kyle Trask is the starting quarterback. It's probably not going to be a great situation for Tampa Bay, and I do think that unless this team really overperforms expectations, there's a decent chance that Bowles is the scapegoat and gets fired. I do think that as a head coach, he has struggled at times to be situationally aware and always kind of getting the most out of their players. They underperformed a lot last year. A lot of people thought they'd be one of the best teams in the league, and they snuck into the playoffs only because the NFC South was terrible. So I think another year of something similar, and he might be out the door. Next, we have Mike Vrabel. I think Vrabel is one of the better coaches in the league for sure. I love just his hard-nosed, tough, consistent football that he just brings on a day-to-day basis, and somebody that consistently outperforms the roster talent. Even last year, they were playing Josh Dobbs and Malik Willis, who they weren't even letting throw the ball, and they still were only one game away from winning the division and making the playoffs. And a team that was beat up, they just weren't the most talented, and he still made them competitive. I think a lot of people sleep on how good Mike Vrabel is as a head coach. I think he's one of the better coaches in the league for sure. Next, we have Rivera. He's definitely on the hot seat in my opinion. He's just kind of lost his touch. I think he was a great coach for the Panthers, but I do think the NFL maybe hasn't passed him by, but I do think he's just not going to be the same innovative creator. He's a decent CEO type, but he's not somebody that just truly is very inspiring at this point. The Commanders don't have a real set-in-stone quarterback with Sam Howell set to currently start. I just think that there's a decent chance that they have a bit of a rough season, and Rivera is kind of the scapegoat and gets kicked out of the door. Next, we have Kyle Shanahan. Shanahan deserves to be one of the best coaches in the league. His offensive mind has just shaped the entire NFL at this point. His scheme, his ability to know what levers to pull. He's at least the second best offensive line in the league. It's either him or Andy Reid. They run different systems, but he is the entire architect behind pretty much the offense that at least half the NFL runs. He's just so consistently getting the most out of players. He doesn't need an elite quarterback. Jimmy G, Brock Purdy, doesn't matter who's back there. They're competitive. They're in the NFC Championship game almost every year, it feels. And Kyle Shanahan absolutely deserves that credit. You would love to see him get that Super Bowl win that he's kind of been eluding him for a long time, but I do think that he is one of the best in the league and truly impressive. Next, we have DeMeco Ryans. He is unproven, but very exciting. He's somebody that I thought was an incredibly qualified head coaching candidate. He's somebody that's very relatable, young. He's going back to the team that he played for. I definitely think he's incredibly exciting, and I do think he was the best head coaching hire this offseason with a team that still has a lot of holes, but has some promise. I am very excited to see what DeMeco Ryans can do. Shane Steichen up next. I think that he did a really good job designing the offense in Philadelphia last year. I think Anthony Richardson is going to thrive with him as the offensive coordinator / head coach, him calling plays. I think he will get the most out of Anthony Richardson like he did with Jalen Hurts. I do think there will be an adjustment period, but I am very excited to see what Steichen can do in the future with him at the helm. Then we have Kevin O'Connell. I think O'Connell did show to be a great coach there. I do think O'Connell proved to be a great head coach, somebody that won a lot of close one-score games. They won 13 games with Kirk Cousins last year, and some injuries, and they've dealt with kind of a lot. They really outperformed their expectations last year. They were a very good team. Obviously, it was not the ending they hoped for, losing in the playoffs, but I do think that he has a really good offensive mind, somebody that I do think could be one of the better young head coaches moving up in the league. And just his first year really showed a lot of great things, so I'm excited to see what he can do in the future. If you like this kind of content, please hit that subscribe button down below. Really helps grow the channel. While you're down there, please hit that like button as well. Would really help me out. Let me know who you think should be higher, who should be lower, who's the best head coach in the NFL. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one.